I have to confess, my knowledge of 50s and 60s American cinema is a bit limited. It's just never been a particular period of cinematic history that's held much interest for me. Perhaps it's the lack of nostalgia I have for that particular era, or the naturally tame and safe nature that the Hays Code injected into everything. Point is, I'm very much coming at this from an outsider's perspective, which is probably important to note. Your perspective can be affected as much by lack of nostalgia as it can by nostalgia, especially when it comes to media that's meant to be viewed in one's formative years. Anyway, it was most likely Mystery Science Theater 3000 that began the trend of digging up old children's movies from the era of kiddie matinees and poking fun at them.
Whoa, now this is good old-fashioned nightmare fuel.
At that point, folks like me, who had no real nostalgic attachment to the matinee era of children's cinema, started to realise, something was a bit off about those old kids' movies, wasn't it? We're not talking about all the kids' movies of that era, of course. We're talking about a very specific kind. I don't know if there's really an exact term for the kind of movies I'm thinking of here, or even if they could really be sorted into any single category. However, in one of his Cinema Snob reviews, critic Brad Jones used the term Grindhouse children's films, and I think that, at the very least, encompasses a lot of them. There's a weird dissonance to the way these movies present themselves. The content is, of course, invariably family-friendly, sometimes patronizingly so, but the general aesthetics and structure of the film, with their flimsy sets and craft shop costumes, extremely hokey acting, and scripts that are usually half-baked at best, often evoke the feeling of grindhouse cinema. Not helping this comparison is, of course, the fact that many of these films were, in fact, created by directors who had a number of actual grindhouse films under their belt. Remember Herschel Gordon Lewis, also known as the grandfather of gore and the creator of Blood Feast? Yeah, he also gave us the magic land of Mother Goose. But above and beyond that, what really sets this particular kind of children's cinema apart, and makes it such easy fodder for mockery and bile fascination, is how uniquely weird they are. In fact, these films are arguably some of the best examples of unintentional surrealism in cinema. After all, there's a reason I wrote about this exact same topic for 366 Weird Movies a few years ago. Now, much of this weirdness stems from the sheer ineptitude with which these movies were made. Some of them are so crudely put together that they barely qualify as movies, and come off like they were made by someone who'd never seen a proper piece of cinema in their life. One of the most infamous examples of this is, of course, 1965's Fun in Balloon Land. Created by an uncredited director and starring an uncredited cast, this movie, if you can call it that, is in fact two completely unrelated pieces of film slapped clumsily end to end. In the first part, a boy dreams about wandering through a cavernous warehouse interacting with various balloon floats, whose bulbous, crudely painted features are pulled right out of a child's nightmare. The second part consists of footage of balloons at the Philadelphia Thanksgiving parade, overlaid with the voice of a female narrator who gushes over each and every balloon with truly frightening enthusiasm.
Slithery snake, you sliding slithery snake, slide along past me. Yes, I don't want to be a snake charmer. You have lots of clowns to charm you. I'm glad I'm not walking with you. Oh, you were too long, yes, for me.
It's fascinating for the utter ineptitude it displays at even the most basic elements of filmmaking. But at the same time, while it's an extreme example, Fun in Balloon Land does nicely exemplify what makes a children's grindhouse movie distinct. Content so family-friendly and wholesome that it's intensely condescending, played out against a backdrop of desolate, empty-looking sets and set pieces so poorly made that they become horrifying, all put together so haphazardly that what little narrative there is becomes unintentionally abstract. For another especially gratuitous example, there's Santa's Christmas elf named Calvin. Slapdash to a truly remarkable degree, this thing masquerading as a feature-length children's movie is in fact nothing but a series of still photographs, mostly images of the characters represented by cheap-looking toys in various awkward and poorly lit poses. It's barely a few steps above what a bored child with a smartphone camera and a video editing app might slap together in 10 minutes nowadays. Even the films that mostly manage to adhere to the general conventions of cinema do so in the most absurd ways. Case in point, Santa and the Ice Cream Bunny. Widely regarded as one of the absolute worst things in cinematic history these days, this slapdash film stands out because of how absurdly layered it is. We open with a trite half-story about Santa Claus' sleigh getting stuck on a beach in Florida and about an inch of sand. After a group of children attempt to force a few very uncomfortable animals, and a man in a gorilla suit, to attempt to pull the sleigh free, Santa Claus sits them down to tell them the story of Thumbelina. At this point, the film reveals its multiple layers as we transition to a young woman making her way through Pirates World, a rundown Florida theme park. After she samples a few of the, frankly, very unsafe-looking rides, she makes her way indoors and sits down to peruse a diorama display that tells the story of Thumbelina. And here the film transitions again, this time to a shoestring retelling of Thumbelina. This occupies the bulk of the film, which doesn't return to Santa or even reveal the identity of the titular ice cream bunny until the very closing scene. It's an absurd number of layers for what amounts to a low-budget retelling of a public domain children's story. It's like a children's movie with the structure of an epistolary novel. Of course, this is entirely unintentional. The film is structured like this because, similar to Fun in Balloon Land, it's a bunch of unrelated segments crudely stitched together. Its central part, the Thumbelina adaptation, is a completely separate movie from the Santa segment, made several years earlier by famed exploitation director Barry Mahon. Unsurprisingly, it was commissioned by Pirates World in a last-ditch attempt to drum up some interest in the park. Unsuccessfully, as it would end up closing its doors only a few years later. Disney World had just opened, and let's be honest, there was no way this place was going to compete. The Santa segments were made later on by a completely different director, and clumsily slapped around the Thumbelina movie in order to justify a Christmas screening. No better time of year, after all, to squeeze a few extra dimes out of the kids. For another example, let's look at another Santa Claus movie, the one MST3K made fun of. In technical terms, it's probably one of the most coherently told narratives in the world of children's Grindhouse, but the nature of that narrative is absurd. We follow the story of Santa Claus, who in this universe operates not out of the North Pole, but a castle in space, and in place of elves is assisted by a gaggle of child laborers from various different countries. Moreover, Santa has apparently usurped the role of the Christian god in this movie, as he has an ongoing rivalry with Lucifer himself, who sends his groveling assistant Pitch up to earth in order to plant mischievous thoughts in the minds of children and get them put on Santa's naughty list.
And Satan scores!
Darn that devil! Oh, I'm sorry, but that old devil is always annoying me with his mischief. If I could only go down there now, I'd put him in his place.
Oh, big
But everyone
talker.
knows I can only
Seriously
go down to
though,
Earth
check out that
on Christmas Eve and
MST3K
not
episode,
before.
it's brilliant. The film is also replete with absurd imagery, with a particular reoccurring theme being the bizarre and occasionally nightmarish tools Santa uses to spy on the children of the world. I like to call this kind of fictional tech toy punk. Again, it's highly likely that the absurd, almost dreamlike nature of this movie is mostly unintentional, and it makes fractionally more sense when you consider it in context. The film was made essentially to introduce the concept of Santa Claus, and of the American version of Christmas in general, to Mexico, where Christmas was still heavily rooted in Catholic traditions at the time. Blatantly Christian elements like devil-inspired temptations and universally recognized mythical figures such as Merlin may feel out of place in a Santa Claus story nowadays, but at the time they were likely the most effective way of making this weird icon of Western folklore seem, in the eyes of Mexican families, a slight bit more palatable as part of the Christmas tradition. Overall, when you consider it, it's rather unsurprising that these films came together as the absurd messes that they did. For context, let's look at one of the biggest names in the children's Grindhouse business, Florida businessman K. Gordon Murray. He's not exactly a celebrated name among cinephiles, but this man's impact on mid-20th century cinema really can't be downplayed. In the 50s and 60s, Murray made himself a small fortune importing movies from foreign countries, dubbing them in English, and releasing them to the American public. Many of his imports were schlocky, low-budget horror movies from Mexico, which contributed a great deal to the growth of the mexploitation subgenre. However, Murray also brought over a good number of children's films, mostly cheap productions based on fairy tales. Many of these movies were shown back-to-back at cheap weekend screenings, and as a result, Murray is often credited with inventing the kiddie matinee. But besides this, many of the children's films he imported would become defining examples of children's Grindhouse. Indeed, it's thanks to Murray that we got some of the most iconic, for lack of a better term, examples of the subgenre, including 1959's Santa Claus and those absurd Red Riding Hood movies from Mexico. And when you look at how Murray approached the production of children's cinema, the absurd and sometimes otherworldly nature of children's Grindhouse starts to make at least a little more sense. Murray broke into entertainment right out of high school with a travelling bingo parlour and a slot machine empire, declaring himself the youngest owner in show business at age 22. Indeed, Marge Nagel, an actress who provided voices for several of Murray's dubs, referred to him as the Barnum of film. This was a man who, from a young age, was clearly well acquainted with the business of showmanship and entertainment. However, it's also clear that that was what it was to him, a business. He was in many ways the Roger Corman of children's cinema, clearly much less concerned with artistic merit, and much more with getting as many low-budget movies onto the market as possible to maximize his ROI. This isn't inherently a bad thing in and of itself. There's a reason so many people fondly remember Corman movies, after all. And if Murray's now-defunct fan site is anything to go by, there are even a few folks who unironically enjoyed his films back in the day. Plus, you've got to give the man credit for making an effort to turn a profit in children's cinema, an industry which, even more so back then than now, was essentially owned by Disney. And unlike Pirates World, he was actually able to make a profit as he worked in Disney's shadow. That takes dedication. But let's be honest, it's not as if Murray was especially selective with the stuff he decided to put out. If it could be dubbed and shown at cheap screenings for a profit, he wanted it. Production values and narrative coherence be damned. In some cases, such as Santa Claus, the movies he imported were very clearly made primarily with a local audience in mind, which of course only added to their absurdity once they were dubbed. In short, the children's films this man was responsible for were uniquely absurd not because of any artistic vision on his part, but because taking the time to pick out movies that were coherent and conventional might have cut into his profits. In fact, when you think of it, there's another thing that these films can be compared to besides Grindhouse. They were essentially the YouTube Kids of their day. Like the content of the average YouTube Kids channel, these movies were churned out en masse, with production values and narrative coherence taking a backseat to sheer volume of content. And like with YouTube Kids, not all of them are bad by any means, but no reasonable person would claim there's anything in the way of real artistic merit to them. And like with YouTube Kids, some of the stuff out there is just plain nightmarish. I should really be clear, however this whole video might come off, my intention here is not to simply point and laugh at these movies, or to imply that low-budget, low-effort, low-quality children's movies are something that was unique to the 50s and 60s. They very much aren't. Moreover, I genuinely enjoy some of these movies. Santa Claus in particular is an enchantingly corny affair that I plan to add to my list of annual Christmas viewings. No, my intention is to simply highlight an intriguing segment of cinematic history, and a type of film that is unique not in being bad, but in its very distinctive, very weird type of badness. There'll always be opportunists out there churning out bad children's media to make a quick buck, but this particular era of bad children's media has some very distinct characteristics that will most likely never be recreated. This, in my opinion, makes it worth remembering. Thank you very much for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing. I plan to pick up my upload schedule from this point onward.